At this time, I'd like to introduce Ralph Cossa. Ralph is President Emeritus with WSD Honda Chair in Peace Studies. Mr. Cossa sits on the boards of numerous foreign relations organizations throughout the Asia-Pacific region, and as a recognized expert on U.S. Asia-Pacific foreign relations and policy, Mr. Cossa joins conferences for political, economic, military, and business leaders in countries around the world. The best part is he speaks in a language that we all can understand him. Please join me in welcoming Ralph Cossa.
Vernon, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
It's great to be back. Peter tells me I have to keep coming back until I get it right, so I guess I haven't gotten there yet, but hopefully we're getting close. I do look forward to the opportunity to one day do this again in person. I've always enjoyed the meetings and the interactions, and especially the Q&A session. So I'm going to try to keep my formal remarks as short as possible so we can get into questions.
Thank you.
So what's going on in the world today? Well, the answer is a lot. We've got the Russians building up forces on the Ukraine border again. We've got the French and the Australians refusing to talk to one another because the Aussies canceled a submarine contract with the French in order to get American and British nuclear-powered submarines, which in turn has upset the non-proliferation community for reasons that totally befuddle me. We've got the Middle East, still the Middle East. Afghanistan is an absolute mess. Myanmar exercise in democracy has failed, and there's been a terrible coup and fighting in the streets there. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, has likewise failed in dealing with the problem. In Japan, we've had 3 prime ministers since we last talked. In South Korea, we've got elections coming up, which will be a typical crazy season. While the North Koreans continue to be the North Koreans, now trying to develop submarine-launched ballistic missiles, although being almost strangely quiet. These are some of the things I won't be talking about today, although in the Q&A session, I'm happy to go over them or anything else. What I want to focus on today is US-China relations, where we are, how we got there, where we're going. And I'll start off by saying we're clearly on a collision course with China today. Some people want to call this a new Cold War. It depends on how you define Cold War. If by Cold War you mean a struggle between capitalism and communism, this probably isn't it. If by Cold War you mean a struggle between democracy and authoritarianism or totalitarianism, welcome to Cold War 2.0. It really doesn't matter what we call it. The reality is that we're on a collision course today. How did we get there? Well, I blame one particular leader, a leader who was overly nationalistic, narcissistic, antagonistic, who was tactically clever, but strategically foolish, if not misled or misguided. And I am not talking about Donald Trump. I'm talking about Chinese leader Xi Jinping. I think Mr. Trump helped make things worse, and I'll explain how in a minute. But the real problem has been China under Xi Jinping's leadership. He put China on a collision course with the United States, and it took the US a while to figure that out and then to adjust, and we've been adjusting ever since. I wrote an article about a year ago now, which I'm happy to share with anyone who's interested, saying that if we want to get China policy right, we got to get China right. I think that Barack Obama, when he first became president, had the right policy, but for the wrong China. He had a policy that was geared toward the China of the former paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping, one whose motto was hide your strength and bide your time. And it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. He was, socialism with Chinese characteristics, which looked very much like capitalism. That changed under Xi Jinping, first as vice president and then when he became president. Today, the collective leadership idea that was instituted by Deng is essentially gone. Xi has arranged for himself to be president for life. His 2 terms of office theoretically are up this spring, but don't be surprised if he manages to stay on for another 5, 10, 15, or however many years he is able to cling to power. He also did away with biding your time and hiding your strength, and instead we got the Chinese wolf warrior diplomats whose motto was China is a big country and you're not, at least to China's neighbors, and certainly a much more aggressive and assertive foreign policy. The Trump administration actually got China right initially. This is the Trump administration that was national security policy was guided by then Secretary of Defense Mattis and National Security Advisor McMaster. President Trump, quite frankly, was a little bit clueless on what was happening in China. He seemed to admire Xi Jinping, as he continued to admire throughout his tenure, Vladimir Putin. But the national security documents clearly showed China as a revisionist power and one that was challenging US national security interest. About halfway through the Trump administration, the president decided that it was politically expedient to brand Xi Jinping as evil. This particularly after COVID, when the Chinese tried to blame COVID on us rather than accept responsibility and allow a thorough investigation of how it started in China, where it clearly started. But at the same time, Mike Pompeo became Secretary of State, and John Bolton, a person who I've had my own clashes with throughout the last 20 or 30 years, became the National Security Advisor. And we decided that the problem was not Chinese behavior, but Chinese ideology. We no longer criticize the Chinese government. We now criticize the Chinese Communist Party. Why does this matter? Well, what matters is if we wanted to press China to change its behavior, we'd have a lot of people sign up for that. And the Chinese might find it expedient to do that. When we tell China it has to change its ideology, which is the basis of the power of the current leadership, they see this as the beginning of a new Cold War. And they're going to do everything they can to further undermine our interests and compete while keeping the playing field as unlevel as they can. Today, under the Biden administration, we have the 3 C's. We have cooperate where we can, compete where we should, and confront where we must, while avoiding the 4th C, which is confrontation, the collision that we're on a course for, but that both sides are bound to determine not to allow happen. Unfortunately, as we all know, and we've seen in the movies and games of chicken, sometimes the person veers off a little too late and an unintended collision occurs, and that's probably the real danger in US-China relations today. I think that we are now trying to get China policy right for the right China, but we still have to recognize that Chinese are moving in a direction that is not in US national interest, and that is becoming more and more aware around the world, which is why you have things like the Quad, where the US, Australia, Japan, and India are now forming a somewhat strategic relationship. You have AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US deal, which is not only to provide nuclear-powered submarines to Australia, but also to provide more advanced technology to our Australian allies to serve somewhat as a counter to China. Will this result in a collision? I don't know. I don't think it's inevitable. I certainly hope not. But I do think that there are going to be challenges that we need to rise to, and it requires effective management. What's changed in the United States is that while the Democrats and Republicans can agree on almost nothing else, they both do agree on China being the primary threat to our national security and to our security interests. And I think this is a good thing as long as we keep it in perspective. I hear people talking about China being an existential threat. If you understand the meaning of the existential, you will understand that the United States is an existential threat to China. We are capable of undermining its system or even destroying its population. China is a challenge to US primacy. It's a challenge to US interests, but it is not an existential threat. North Korea is not an existential threat to the United States. We are to them. They are to South Korea and potentially to Japan. The only existential threat to the United States, that's another nation existential threat, is Russia. And fortunately, we are also an existential threat to Russia, and that has kept things balanced during the Cold War, and it keeps things balanced today. So it's important to not blow the threat out of proportion. In my view, it's important to focus on Chinese behavior rather than on Chinese ideology and looking for solutions so that we can, A, build a broader coalition. That coalition, incidentally, to be effective, needs to include countries like Vietnam. But if your basic reason to exist is to fight communism, well, then the Vietnamese are not going to sign up for that, since that happens to be their way of government. If it's based on Chinese behavior, the Vietnamese have 2,000 or 3,000 years of experience in dealing with the Chinese with no love lost and no trust. And we can form, I think, a useful coalition with Vietnam to counter China. In the middle of all of this, you have India, which is now a member of the Quad. On Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, India is America's best friend. On Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, they pretend that they're the best friend of Russia and worry about US unilateralism. And on Sunday, I guess they rest or try to deal with their schizophrenia. I think it's useful, and I applaud Japan in particular for bringing India into this arrangement called the Quad, but I wouldn't spend a lot of time counting on India as being one of the real instruments of power politics in the region. I do, however, believe that Japan, primarily under Mr. Abe, but under the new leadership, which still is sticking to the Abe line, has in fact turned out to be a very forward-thinking ally. This is in part because of 50 or 60 years of good friendship between the US and Japan. It's also in part because the Chinese have them very nervous. I was involved with earlier this week in 2 days of virtual dialogue with Chinese strategic thinkers. The Chinese accused America of wanting to keep tensions on the Korean Peninsula as an excuse for the US to maintain a military presence in Asia. My response to them was, we don't need North Korea as an excuse, since China has provided all the excuse we need. And it is China's behavior, not North Korea, that has caused the Japanese the most concern, and has caused Australia, India, and all the countries of Southeast Asia to want to make sure that the United States hangs around. They don't necessarily want us to declare a new Cold War and insist that people take sides. But clearly, when you have a 600-pound gorilla in your backyard, and that's China, you want a 1,600-pound gorilla on your front porch, and that remains the United States. And as much as we hear all of these things about, China, 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 the power difference, while the gap may have narrowed, has definitely narrowed. The preponderance of power still rested with the United States. And the fact that, unlike China, the United States has reliable allies that we can cooperate with. China's friends and allies are few and far between in their countries like North Korea and Cambodia, who are probably not the best of bedfellows. Anyway, rather than ramble on as I'm inclined to do, I thought I would stop here and just throw the floor open for questions and see what's on people's minds and see how I can perhaps either make you feel worse or perhaps make you feel better. So I'll stop here. I would note, as a commercial, if you're not on Pacific Forum's mailing list and you would like to be, just send me a note, Ralph@pacforum.org, and I'm happy to do that. If questions come up later, again, send me an email, Ralph@pacforum.org, and we're happy to respond. So, questions?
Ralph, right now we don't have any questions, and if anybody does have any questions, you can either put it in the chat or in the Q&A box. So if you have any other topics you want to cover, that would be great.
Well, let me say a few words about North Korea, which is what I used to. Okay, someone says keep going, so you asked for it. I'll keep going. I'll say a few words about North Korea. Those of you who are veterans of my presentations recall that the first couple of times I spoke to this group, it was almost exclusively on North Korea. That was at a time where people like CNN were complaining about, the North Koreans were going to be launching missiles that were going to hit Hawaii. I, at the time, poo-pooed that. I still do. But I do think that we have to take North Korea seriously. The North Koreans are convinced that they are the new Soviet Union, that they are a powerful nuclear weapon state. In reality, they're trying desperately to survive. And I think when President Biden wakes up in the morning, he says, here are the 100 things I need to do today, and North Korea is nowhere on that list. And his goal and the national security community's goal in the United States is to keep North Korea off that list. The North Koreans, of course, would rather be hated than ignored. So there's always possibility they'll, fire a missile or conduct a nuclear test or an ICBM test, which the press will then call a crisis. In my own view, a crisis is when people are being killed. Otherwise, it's just an annoyance. And the North Koreans, I think, are more annoying than anything else. What I failed to talk about, and as a question has come up, is Taiwan. At the end of August, beginning of September, I chaired a meeting with about 100 national security specialists from the United States and Taiwan. We had initially planned to hold a meeting in person. After I had flown people in from the mainland and from Taipei, the governor told me that I couldn't have more than 10 people in the room. It happened about 3 days before our meeting. And as a result, we had two rooms side by side with 10 people in each and other people in their hotel room dialing in. So it was sort of a hybrid meeting, but I think very fruitful nonetheless. There's actually a report that just went onto our website that if you're interested, www.pacforum.org, and you can find under issues and insights our report on Taiwan. There's a debate in the United States, several debates in the United States One is whether or not a Chinese invasion is imminent. In my view, it is not, at least not a military invasion. I do think, however, that Taiwan is already under attack from China. It's under attack economically, politically, and psychologically through a very sophisticated social media campaign. And that's what we need to be focusing on, even as we help Taiwan build up its own defenses. The other big debate in the United States is between whether or not we should continue our policy of strategic ambiguity. What this means is to maintain a policy that convinces China that we will defend Taiwan, but makes Taiwan not so sure about it so that Taiwan won't do anything to prompt a crisis. This strategy has served us very well over the years. But there's questions as to whether or not, even within that strategy, we can and should be a little bit more forthcoming in talking about defending Taiwan. President Biden, in what appears to actually have been a gaffe, did that at a CNN town hall where, when he was asked, will the US defend Taiwan? He said, yes, of course, we have an obligation to do that. Actually, we have an obligation to help Taiwan defend itself. There's a nuanced difference. Everything in dealing with Taiwan has a great deal of nuance. And in this case, helping Taiwan defend itself doesn't necessarily mean sending US troops. It does mean providing with the military wherewithal, but it's very clear, and it came through very clear in our conference, that if the Taiwan people do not believe that there is a high probability that the US will come to its defense, they really have no other option other than to surrender. China has become so big and so powerful that it is very hard for essentially 24 million people on the island of Taipei to successfully fight off a billion plus Chinese that have over 1 million people in their military, the largest military in the world. On the other hand, Chinese have to project power 90 miles across the Taiwan Strait, which can be difficult and which can be made more difficult. And as long as they face the prospect of the US and others, Japan, Australia, for instance, becoming involved, they have to think twice. It's the sort of risk-reward calculus. You need to make the risks high enough that it outweighs the potential rewards of conducting military operations against Taiwan. From a Chinese perspective, they'd much rather win without fighting, the old Sun Tzu strategy, than to have to use military force and suffer the potential consequences, which would be severe, not only militarily, but economically and politically. So there's a stalemate across the strait. The current leadership in Taiwan under the Democratic Progressive Party is perhaps a bit more antagonistic toward the mainland, but they're not foolish, they're not suicidal. And President Tsai Ing-wen, who has been here to Hawaii and who I've met with a number of times over the last 30 years, is a pragmatist. And she's smart, very smart, and knows that you don't wave a red flag in front of the bull. And in fact, she's been quite accommodating to the Chinese while still staying true to DPP's mission and philosophy. The other primary political party, the KMT, is more inclined to get along and go along with China, but is no more eager to reunite with China than the DPP or with any other than about 3 or 4% of the people in Taiwan, most of whom are over 80 and still remember the good old days when the Republic of China ran all of China. So the division, I think, is permanent. The Chinese used to be able to live with that as long as Taiwan didn't formally declare independence. But Xi Jinping appears to be a risk taker. He and many Chinese have set the year 2049 as the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China and the time by which China should be returned to its natural order and previous greatness, which would include recovering, if you will, Taiwan. Others feel the timetable has been moved up. Admiral Davidson, the former Pacific Command commander, had said he thought China would be capable of taking Taiwan within 6 years. Others have decided that he really meant 6 minutes and that the Chinese are about ready to attack as soon as the Olympics are over. I don't believe that. And I think even if they're capable of doing it in 6 to 10 years, if we keep the risk factor high enough, then they will not act on that capability because of the potential consequences and the political, economic, as well as military costs. So I think there's still a balance across the strait. There's a lot that Taiwan can and should be doing in order to make itself the poisoned shrimp, if you will. Even if it could be swallowed by China, it would give China great indigestion. This is sort of the poison shrimp is the strategy that Singapore has used for years. There's also, it's been called the porcupine strategy, where again, you make it very uncomfortable to attack you. But clearly, there has to be some sense of confidence that the United States will be there to support you, will come to your aid. And the majority of people in Taiwan today do believe that the United States, they even believe that Japan will come to their assistance. And of course, the Australians and the EU and others have been speaking out in support of Taiwan, primarily because of the Chinese heavy-handedness. China has been putting a lot of pressure on Taiwan, and they've been flying a lot of flights into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. These flights are not illegal, by the way. We also fly into China's air defense identification zone, but they certainly raise the risk of accident. And they're aimed at sending a message, according to the Chinese, they're aimed at sending a message to Taiwan. Well, I'm here to tell China that the message has been received, but it's not the message that they wanted to send. It's essentially convinced the Taiwanese that they need to do more to defend themselves. And it's convinced the rest of the world that we need to come to the aid of a fellow democracy. And that's what we're seeing happening. This is why I started off by describing Xi Jinping as tactically clever, but strategically foolish. The immediate goal, frightening Taiwan, mission accomplished. But strategically, he's managed to turn the world against him and to rally people's support for Taiwan. The same is the case in Hong Kong, where the Chinese have clamped down and successfully muted any kind of criticism of the Chinese Communist Party or of Xi in what was otherwise a very democratic enclave. But what it's told the rest of the world is that when China signs a legally binding treaty, as it did with the UK over reversion of Hong Kong, that treaty is not worth the paper it's written on. So it's sensitized the rest of the world. And this is why you see the European Union, where EU parliamentarians are visiting Taiwan today and have been very critical of Chinese actions in Hong Kong, have backfired. So I think Xi Jinping is clearly not a strategic thinker, but we still have to worry if he tactically believes that he's capable of conquering Taiwan, but doesn't understand the strategic consequences. There is an opportunity for miscalculation. Therefore, as I mentioned earlier, repeatedly, you have to raise the risk factor.
Ralph, we have a couple questions. Did you want
Sure,
to take
please.
some of them?
Yes, go ahead.
Sure. The first one is, do you think China is a large factor in the supply chain issues around the world?
Well, clearly China is a large factor, but it's certainly not the only one. And it's not because China is trying to not export. China relies on these exports for its own economy. The problem in some cases, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert on this, but it's all the ships that are backed up at the various United States ports and global ports that have not been able to get unloaded because of manpower restrictions caused by COVID. And obviously, COVID is still a challenge, and it's making it, I think, very difficult to get this supply chain back in action. I think it's sent us a useful message that we don't want to rely on the Chinese, since they could then use this for strategic reasons rather than just for economic purposes. And also this whole idea that had come to the past on, having a supply chain that was just ready, just in time supply, so that you didn't have to worry about things piling up in warehouses, was perhaps a nice strategy when you could rely on an international flow of logistics. But this is becoming more and more troublesome. And I think people are going to be wanting to start stockpiling their warehouses again. And we're already, I think, seeing some of that take place.
Thank you. The next question is, how have U.S. businesses in China been affected?
Well, this is a great question. And 5 years ago, one of the main allies of China was the U.S. business community. And they were putting pressure on the president, certainly pressure during the Obama administration, to keep things on the straight and narrow with China, to put pressure on them to open up, but not so much as to kill the golden goose. Unfortunately, the Chinese have done a good job of killing their own golden geese. Companies working in China today are in many cases more paranoid. There was the old joke in Russia that, the Russians heard a knock on the door in the middle of the night and opened the door and said, "Oh, thank God it's only a fire," as opposed to someone to take you away. I think people are now worried in China about knocks on the door in the middle of the night. And certainly the most successful entrepreneurs in China who thought that they were now cushioned to the point where they could actually speak their mind have found out that they can't. Jack Ma is now extremely quiet and no longer dares to criticize Xi Jinping. And certainly if you're an American businessman or a Canadian businessman or a European businessman in China, you live in fear. When the Canadians detained the Huawei executive, and the Chinese turned around and essentially kidnapped and held hostage two Canadian business people who were not coincidentally released the same day that the Huawei executive was released. This sent a real loud warning bells through the business community. 5 years ago, the big chaebols in South Korea were investing tons of money in China. Today, they're moving to Vietnam, they're moving to India, to Bangladesh, to Indonesia, to getting out of China as fast as they can because of the Chinese economic blackmail after the South Koreans had the nerve to bring in American air defense systems to defend themselves against the North Koreans, much to China's dismay. And the Middle Kingdom Empire did not give his approval to it. Japanese businesses are starting to move elsewhere. American businesses are still starting to move elsewhere. And even in Hong Kong, there's a lot of entrepreneurs in Hong Kong I had a businessman in Hong Kong a couple of years ago say, Ralph, remember the boat people of Vietnam? I said, sure. He said, we're going to be the yacht people. And when things get too tough in Hong Kong, we're going to hop in our yachts and we're going to head for Canada. We all have passports now, dual passports. Vancouver is jokingly called Hongcouver by many of the Chinese. And we're going to see a brain drain leaving Hong Kong as well because of Chinese heavy-handedness. So I think that there's some real serious problems among the business community. As my Hong Kong friend told me, as long as I can keep making money, I'm staying, but the day I can't, I'm getting the hell out of here. And I think a lot of American businessmen are also saying, you know, we can go to Vietnam. Vietnam is the rule of law. You make a deal with a Vietnamese company and that deal is solid. You make a deal with the Chinese and that's tomorrow's negotiating position as they try to chip away at it. So I think the business community is seeing the light. It is no longer China's best friend, but is part of the chorus in complaining about Chinese behavior. And this is going to hurt the Chinese in the long run. Again, it's what I call premature arrogance on the part of the Chinese, which they're just, I think, starting to feel.
Okay,
Other
last question.
Yeah, sure.
What impact on real estate investors from China do you see?
Well, I think there is going to be an impact. Maybe it'll be countered by Hong Kong investors coming in. I don't think there are any reduction in the number of Chinese with money who would love to invest in Hawaii. I think the challenge is going to be being able to get their money out, being able to conduct that investment. So I think that's sort of the real challenge. I do think, however, that we're going to see an upswing in other areas, certainly as COVID eases up. We're going to see, I think, more Japanese and more Koreans again coming in and wanting to invest in real estate, and Australians, Canadians, and others. So I'm not sure that the net effect will be very bad, but I certainly would expect that we'll see some reduction in Chinese investment, not because of a lack of attractiveness or a lack of desire, but because the Chinese government is going to make it much harder for this cash flow to continue.
Okay, we actually had one more come in, and we've got time for it. In our attempts to build relationships with countries in the Pacific, we have criticized China's South China Sea policy. Are our arguments undermined by Diego Garcia and the ICJ ruling of the Chagos Archipelago?
The short answer is no, I don't think so. I mean, there are some people who are concerned about the US in Diego Garcia, but Diego Garcia has clearly and for a long time been owned and operated by the Brits, and we have a legal lease to do that, even though there are others that may conflict on the claim. Chinese actions in the South China Sea are completely different. The Chinese have ignored UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. They have gone and turned the low tide elevations into man-made islands, and then claimed 12-mile limits around those and exclusive economic zones around what are essentially uninhabitable rocks that they have put military bases on, military bases which increase China's shadow today, but which we in the Air Force used to call a target-rich environment if there was ever a conflict. The last place I would ever want to be is on one of these Chinese man-made islands if a conflict between the US and China erupts. Besides that, global warming might take care of those islands before we do. So there's a vast difference. The real challenge in the South China Sea is that there are 5 or 6 claimants to many, if not all, of the islands. And the inability of the other claimants, particularly Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, to get their act together, the Philippines, and sort of agree to, divide and share equally and logically, they have essentially allowed the Chinese to play one against the other. And this is why it's been so hard to solve the problem in the South China Sea. If Southeast Asians could get their act together, then they and speak with one voice and without overlapping claims, they'd have a much better chance of dealing with the Chinese. But I'm not counting the days for that to happen. It's just what needs to happen.
Well, thank you, Ralph. And we appreciate your time that you've spent with us today. We always look forward to having you join us at the end of our year. And we want to wish you good health in 2022. And that ends our program for today. So we want to say mahalo and aloha to Guaranteed Rate for sponsoring us again. And everybody out there, please be safe and have a wonderful holiday season. Aloha.
Aloha. And please send me a link also to this so I can hear what I said.
Absolutely, Ralph. You take care.
All righty. Thank you.